welcome to whispers in the dark. Settle in close, dim the lights, and listen carefully, because this is a story of dread that begins with laughter and hospitality and candlelight, and ends with a bedroom so soaked in horror that no prayer spoken over it could ever make it feel clean again. Now let's begin. The crossing had nearly broken Dinah Bellairs. All day the sea had behaved like a malicious living thing. It had lifted and struck the vessel with great cold palms. It had pitched the passengers into green-faced silence, or humiliated them into wretched sounds that Dinah, even hours later, could still hear in memory like a chorus from some floating sick ward. By the time she arrived at the little rural station and saw the dog cart waiting in the weak gold of late afternoon, she felt less like a visitor than like something washed ashore. Jane Watson received her with warm hands and kind eyes, and that particular look worn by women who have settled comfortably into married life. She was no longer young in the fresh, thoughtless way of girls, but she possessed a different beauty now, softened by contentment. Her face had fullness in it. Her mouth had laughter living about it. Her dress was simple and practical, and became her all the better for being so. She had the look of a woman rooted in her home as naturally as ivy roots into stone. Weston House stood a little back from the lane, and seemed, at first glance, less built than overgrown. Ivy climbed its walls in dark, glossy sheets. Clematis swayed over the porch. The windows were partly hidden by leaves, as though the house itself enjoyed the comfort of privacy. It was modest rather than grand, but there was something old and settled in its beams and brickwork. One could imagine generations of lamps lit behind those panes, generations of footsteps softening the stairs, generations of rain darkening the same roof. It gave an impression of peace so complete that one almost distrusted it. Robin Watson came out beneath the porch as they arrived. He was older than Jane by a number of years, a tall gentleman with a healthy color in his face, and a manner shy without being awkward. If Jane possessed warmth, Robin possessed steadiness. There are some men whose whole nature suggests solid walls and well-barred doors and fields that ripen safely under their supervision. He was one of them. There was something quietly reliable in the way he smiled, in the way he took Dinah's hand, in the way he asked after her journey with the practical concern of a host already considering supper, rest, hot water, and every small comfort. Inside, the house was sweet with beeswax, flowers, and old wood. The hall was narrow and cool. The drawing room looked west over a lawn whose edge dissolved into orchard and meadow. Upstairs, the guest chamber prepared for Dinah was bright and simple, with a white spread upon the bed and curtains that stirred faintly in the evening air. Across the passage, directly opposite, lay Jane and Robin's room. Dinah noticed the arrangement in passing and thought nothing of it. Supper revived her. Firelight, clinking china, Jane's cheerful chatter, Robin's dry comments, and the very ordinary grace of domestic happiness worked upon her like medicine. She laughed. She admitted that she had been melodramatic upon the crossing. Jane teased her. Robin promised that once she had slept one country night under his roof, all recollection of the sea would vanish. The dog Smut nosed hopefully for scraps at Jane's skirts. Outside, dusk deepened over the lawns and fields. The windows became black mirrors. A stillness came over the house so gently that it was only by contrast with the day's chaos that Dinah perceived it. Before parting for the night, Jane stood in Dinah's doorway with a candle in hand. Its light softened her face, throwing the rest of the room into agreeable shadow. "You must stay a month," Jane said, smiling. "A month at least. We shall not let you run away after one stormy crossing." Dinah answered with equal good humor. She teased herself as friendless and wandering, with no husband, no house, and no prospect of either, and Jane touched her sleeve in affectionate protest. It was all lightness, all ease, the sort of harmless talk that sits at the edge of bedtime and means nothing at all. Yet later, when Dinah would search her mind for some warning, some crack in the smooth surface of that evening, she would think of Jane standing there with the candle. She would remember the wavering flame, the little room behind her falling into shadow, the faint smell of warm wax, and the way every happiness in Jane's face appeared already as something vulnerable. Dinah undressed slowly, drowsy with exhaustion. The bed looked impossibly inviting. The pillows were cool and clean. The sheets carried the faint scent of lavender. She blew out the candle, slipped beneath the covers, and surrendered herself at once to that heavy, grateful sleep that comes after bodily misery. How long she slept before the dream began, she never knew. At first, she believed she had awakened. That was the terrible cunning of it. There was no floating confusion such as usually belongs to dreams. No absurdity. No shifting place. No nonsense. She thought she had woken in the same room, in the same bed, in the same darkness. She lay still, not fully conscious, listening with that dull half-attention one gives the sounds of night in an unfamiliar house. Then she heard it. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was muffled. A heavy, restless sound, as if struggle were taking place in bedding or on carpet or behind a door meant to keep domestic peace enclosed. There came with it a choked cry, brief and thick, cut short as though a hand had closed over a mouth. Dinah's eyes flew wide open into the dark. She listened. Her own heart beat so violently that she could scarcely hear beyond it. The sound came again. A scuffling, a stifled gasping, the horrible, intimate noises of human beings engaged in something desperate and private and wrong. Fear did not come over her gradually. It struck her whole. She sat upright in bed and felt the cold pass through her like water. The room was blind black. No moon laid a line along the curtains. No ember glowed. The darkness was complete. She thought, with the quick logic of terror, that if danger truly moved in the house, she would rather meet it in the light than cower unseeing. She reached for matches and found none by the bedside. Her fingers slid over wood and linen and emptiness. In the black, she could not even remember clearly where the dressing table stood or how many steps there were between bed and door. The noises had ceased for a moment. That made them worse. Silence seemed to listen back at her. She rose. The boards were cold under her bare feet. She found her dressing gown and dragged it over her shoulders with clumsy hands. Then she began to feel her way through the room. The dark turned every object into an enemy. Her shin struck a chair. The corner of the dressing table bit sharply into her side. She bit down a cry and stumbled onward, palms out, breathing in short, dry breaths. At last her hand found the door handle. The little sound the key made when she turned, it seemed loud enough to wake the dead. She paused, scarcely daring to breathe, and listened at the crack. Nothing, not a murmur, not a whisper, only the vast pressure of midnight in a sleeping house. Then, very slowly, she opened her door. Across the passage, beneath the door opposite, showed a band of redder light than any night lamp should cast. The door to Jane and Robin's room stood slightly ajar. A brighter thread of that red shine fell out upon the floorboards. Dinah stared. The silence had altered. The struggling and half-strangled cries were gone. In their place, she heard only the quiet movement of someone walking about within unstockinged or bare feet. Small, careful motions. The soft business of a person occupied, not hurried, in a room where others ought to have been sleeping. Her mind, frantic for ordinary explanations, seized at them one after another. Perhaps Smut had taken ill. Perhaps Jane was soothing the dog. Perhaps Robin had been seized with some sudden dizziness. Perhaps one of them had cried out under a nightmare, and the other had lit candles. Perhaps, even in the dream, she knew these hopes for lies. She crossed the passage. Each board beneath her seemed to announce her. The air outside the room felt colder than the rest of the house. She came to the partly open door and laid her fingers upon it. There was warmth on the wood, or she imagined warmth, as though the room beyond were fevered. She leaned forward and looked in. For a moment, the sight made no sense. The bed, directly facing the door, seemed at first one great blurred mass of dark and wet crimson, as though scarlet cloth had been flung over it in folds. Her eyes, strained by darkness, refused to comprehend. Then they did comprehend. Jane and Robin were lying in the bed. They were lying where sleep should have held them tenderly, and all tenderness had been ripped out of the room. The white sheets had been turned to hideous stained rags. The pillows were steeped through. Blood had run down the bedding in broad, glistening lanes and gathered thickly along the mattress edge before dripping onto the floorboards below. It had soaked, clotted, smeared, and shone. It had dried black in places and remained bright and fresh in others. There was so much of it that it altered the whole appearance of the chamber, painted the air itself red, made the candle flames look as if they burned through flesh. Robin lay upon his back, his face turned slightly toward Jane, as if even in death he had tried to reach her. But his throat was opened so terribly that no living gesture remained in him. A dreadful gash ran from side to side beneath his jaw, deep enough that the wound seemed less a cut than a savage second mouth pulled grinning through the neck. His nightshirt was ruined, the front of it lacquered with dark wetness. One hand was flung outward on the coverlet, the fingers half curled, each nail rimmed black. Jane lay near the wall. She had not died in stillness. That much was horribly clear. The bedding around her was twisted, dragged, crushed by violence. Her hair, which Dinah had seen so neatly braided before bed, had come loose and clung in damp ropes to her cheeks and throat. One arm was bent between her and the pillows in a last instinctive attempt to shield herself, and the sleeve was sliced through and heavily smeared. Her own throat had been cut with equal brutality. The wound gaped red and glossy, and the skin at its edges was frayed, as if hacked by a rough and eager hand rather than cleanly severed. Her mouth had fallen open. Her eyes were not closed. They stared upward with a fixed astonishment so complete that Dinah felt, even in the dream, that Jane had carried shock into death with her. It was not only the cuts. It was the evidence of everything before and after them. The bruised look of flesh where fingers had clamped. The drag marks of bloody hands upon the sheets. The smears across the bolster where one dying head had rolled. The little fan of droplets thrown onto the wall and tester by some violent movement. The soaking ruin of all that had, only hours earlier, been warm, private, respectable, and safe. The room smelled of hot iron and candle grease and something animal that turned the stomach. Dinah felt it coat the back of her throat. She thought she might retch, and yet she could not move. Someone else was in the room. He had his back partly turned to her and was standing at Jane's dressing table. She had not at first seen him because every faculty had flown straight to the bed. Now he became visible all at once, and with him came a fresh surge of terror so strong that the walls seemed to pulse. He wore the rough, soiled fustian of a laboring man. His clothes hung carelessly upon him, stained at cuff and knee. His shoulders were narrow, but wiry. The candlelight made his neck shine with sweat. In one hand he held a sickle, and the curved blade was wet. Not merely wet, but filmed and running. Red collected along its inner edge in a thick, uneven line and dropped from the point to the floor, where it made a series of dark spotted crescents beside his bare feet. For an instant he bent and laid the sickle down. Then he began to plunder. He opened cases. He snatched at rings. He swept chains and bracelets and brooches with feverish, greedy motions into his pockets. He moved with the composure of a man who believes the worst work finished. There was no visible horror in him, no hurry, no shaking, only the brisk, mean industry of theft following murder. At that angle, above the dressing table, the mirror gave Dinah his face. She saw it distinctly, more distinctly than many real faces seen in daylight. Hair was rough and fell untidily over a low brow. His features had a coarse, broken look, marked by old pits and seams. The mouth was wide and long, and had in repose the same vile suggestion as a grin. The nose jutted. The eyes were small, sly, and bright with an inward cunning. It was not a monstrous face in the sense of deformity. That would have been easier. It was a human face debased into something wolfish and shameless. The face of a man accustomed to resentment, drink, dirt, and casual cruelty. A face one might pass by a roadside or in a harvest field, and only later remember with unease. As Dinah stared, some knowledge entered the dream without words. She knew him for one of Robin's hired men. She knew him as certainly as if someone had whispered the fact into her ear. An Irish laborer come over for harvest. A stranger housed among familiar fields. A tolerated presence becomes suddenly fatal. The door moved under Dinah's hand. It was the faintest creak, nothing more than a hinge yielding. Yet, in that dead room, it rang out like a shriek. The man turned. What Dinah remembered afterward was not a change in his expression, because he had worn no expression worth nomming before that moment. It was rather that his whole face snapped into attention. The eyes locked on hers. She saw recognition there, not of her as Dinah, but of a witness, an inconvenience, another throat needing the hook. He stooped for the sickle. Dinah tried to run. She tried to scream. She did neither. All the grand machinery of terror failed her. Her legs seemed gone. Her voice seemed trapped under her ribs. The room tipped and reeled. The bed, the corpses, the red-stained floor, the reflected face, the lifting sickle, all rushed together into one hideous whirl. Darkness opened beneath her like water, and she fell headlong into it. When she awoke for real, dawn was entering the room. A robin sang outside among the orchard branches with such sweetness that it seemed an indecent contradiction. The bed beneath her was clean. The house was quiet. Her own hands were empty. Her throat hurt from a cry she had not uttered. Yet none of that comforted her. The dream had possessed a coherence more convincing than reality. She could still smell blood. She could still see candlelight shining on the torn throats of Jane and Robin. She could still picture every detail of the murderer's face with the awful accuracy of close observation. Most terrible of all, she could not shake the conviction that what she had seen was not a dream in the ordinary sense, but a vision, a warning, an event already hanging over the house like a blade. When Jane came in fresh from sleep, carrying roses for the breakfast table, Dinah could scarcely speak. Jane laughed at first to see her so pale, then grew uneasy under the intensity of her manner. Dinah began to tell the dream. Once begun, she could not soften it. The words came with all the vividness of the thing itself. Jane listened, at first amused, then impatient, then visibly shaken. Her color failed her when Dinah described the bed as a mass of crimson, and failed more when Dinah named the sickle, the laborer's clothes, the reflected face. Robin heard the tale at breakfast and met it with skeptical good sense. He laughed lightly, not cruelly, but with the cheerful superiority of a man devoted to facts. It was a nightmare born of fatigue, unfamiliar sleeping quarters, the after effect of a violent sea passage, and perhaps too much candlelit storytelling before bed. He would not have Jane frightened by it. To prove the absurdity of Dinah's conviction, he proposed to take her through the fields and show her every laborer employed on the farm. If she could identify her phantom among living men, then he would at least admit to being startled. Dinah accepted at once. Her eagerness surprised them both. The morning had ripened into one of those brilliant harvest days that seem made for abundance and health. Sheaves stood in whitening rows. The fields shone under a clean sun. Dust rose gold around the wagon wheels. Men worked and called to one another in ordinary voices. All the countryside appeared too open, too wholesome, too soaked in light for night terror to have any claim on it. Yet Dinah moved through that brightness as if through a painted veil. Her dream remained more powerful than the sun on her face. She searched each laborer with breath held tight. One by one, the faces disappointed and relieved her. Broad English faces, weathered, bovine, unremarkable. A few glanced at her curiously. A few touched caps. Robin's manner grew more playful as the search lengthened. Jane herself began to recover her spirits. Then they came to the last field. The men were seated along the hedge at dinner, eating bread and bacon in the noon heat. Dinah looked down the row carelessly now, ashamed of her own agitation and almost ready to laugh at it. Then she saw him. He sat not 3 yards away, his elbows on his knees, cutting fat bacon with a clasp knife. Sunlight showed every seam of the skin, every rag of hair, every sly little eye exactly as the mirror had shown them in the dream. There was no confusion, no partial resemblance, no room for doubt. It was the same face that had turned from the dressing table while the murdered couple bled behind him. The same mouth, the same nose, the same pits and shagged brows, the same mean animal look that made the flesh creep. All the blood left Dinah's body. She pointed. She could barely force out the words. There he is. Robin and Jane looked. Robin reasoned. Robin objected that laborers of that class often resembled one another. Robin urged Dinah to look again and be sure. She looked again, and in that moment the man lifted his gaze to hers with such blank recognition that her heart seemed to contract in pain. Though the field stood full of sunlight, she felt the chill of the midnight passage and the sight of the red sickle near the bed. She begged to be taken home. Once there, she pleaded with them not to remain in the house. Let the harvest go. Let the fields be someone else's concern. Let them leave for a few days, a week, any time enough to break whatever doom had formed around them. Robin refused. Reason refused. Economy refused. Pride refused. One does not abandon a harvest and make oneself ridiculous in the district because of a guest's nightmare. Jane, alarmed but sustained by her husband's calm, would not oppose him. Dinah, in her turn, refused to remain another night. She left that afternoon, her packed trunks loaded again almost as soon as unpacked. As the carriage bore her away, she looked back and saw Jane leaning into Robin's shoulder beneath the gate. They looked puzzled, wounded, faintly amused. The picture of them, alive and affectionate in the late light, remained with her all through the journey home. For 3 days, she said almost nothing of the true reason for her return. At moments, she believed herself a fool. At others, she was sure she had escaped only by obedience to warning. Then came a letter from Jane, playful in tone, assuring her that the suspicious laborer had been dismissed. Robin had inquired into him, found him quarrelsome and inclined to drink, paid him off, and sent him packing. Jane made light of the whole matter. She signed herself Jane Watson and told Dinah the danger was over. Reading it, Dinah felt a great loosening in her spirit. Perhaps the dream had done its work after all. Perhaps she had not misread it. Perhaps the evil had been named in time and prevented. The next morning she sat after breakfast among her family, while newspapers were unfolded and discarded. Someone tossed aside the Times with a complaint that there was nothing in it but advertisements and police reports. Dinah picked it up idly. Then she saw the headline: "Shocking Tragedy at Caulfield. Double Murder." The words swam. Still she read. Mr. and Mrs. Watson of Weston House had retired in their usual health and spirits. In the morning, receiving no answer, the servants entered the bedchamber. They found both lying dead upon the bed, with their throats cut from ear to ear. The room presented a hideous spectacle, being literally swimming in blood. A reaping hook had been found near the door. An Irish laborer named Watty Doolan, discharged only days earlier, was under arrest. He had been seen at daybreak, washing his waistcoat in a secluded part of the stream. Jewelry belonging to the murdered couple had been found upon him. Dinah dropped the paper. What follows now is the part that the newspaper did not tell. It did not tell how the house looked under the gray, stunned light of morning after such a night. It did not tell how servants who had polished those floors and aired those sheets must have clung to one another in the passage, sobbing and unable to step fully inside. It did not tell how candle smoke still lingered in the room, mixed with the copper stink of blood turned cold. It did not tell how there are murders so violent that they seem not merely to end lives, but to profane the whole idea of sleeping, of marriage, of domestic shelter. One may imagine it, the bedroom door opening at last to those who had knocked and received no answer. The startled maid putting one foot across the threshold and then screaming from a place deeper than breath. The others rushing in behind her and stopping at once, their courage shattered by the sight. The curtains only partly drawn. The first pale daylight coming through them and touching all the ruin with merciless clarity. The bed a slaughter table, the sheets dark and stiffening, the pillows sunken and sticky, Robin's arm hanging over the side, the fingers nearly touching the floorboards where drops had collected and dried. Jane lying turned toward the wall as if she had tried, in the final instant, to escape through plaster and darkness alike. The grotesque openness of their wounds, the blood that had flowed down and pooled and splashed and thickened, until it seemed impossible that two bodies could contain so much life to lose. Perhaps Robin had awakened first. Perhaps he had grappled in the dark with the intruder and died trying to rise. The bruises on his wrists and the torn bedding would have told some part of that struggle. Perhaps Jane woke to his choking and had only time to turn before the sickle came for her too. Perhaps she had clutched at the blade, cutting her sleeve and hand before the curved edge bit into her throat. Perhaps they had known each other in their last moments. Perhaps they had not. There are mercies and cruelties in such things that no witness can ever untangle. And what of Watty Doolan in that room after the killings were done? The dream had shown him at work among the trinkets, but reality may have been fouler still. One may see him standing over the bed to make sure no movement remained. One may see him breathing hard through his nose, chest heaving, looking upon the slaughter with no more feeling than a butcher. One may see him wipe his hand across his mouth and leave a dark stain there not all his own. One may see him moving to the dressing table, opening jewel cases with fingers still slick, handling the pretty intimate objects of Jane's life, while Jane herself lay butchered less than a yard away. Perhaps he stepped in blood and tracked it. Perhaps he turned at some small sound and listened with his head cocked, the curved hook hanging from his fist like a crimson moon. Perhaps he smiled. The newspapers never tell you if the murderer smiled. Then the retreat, the silent passage, the fields before dawn, the stream where he knelt to scrub at his waistcoat, rubbing the cloth in cold water while the current carried pink clouds away among the weeds. It is a detail so vile in its practicality that it lodges in the mind. Not remorse, not panic, laundry, the mechanical tidying of a man who thinks he has only so much evidence to erase. But no water could have washed the sight from that house. Dinah saw it all in imagination and in memory at once. Worse than imagination, because she had already seen enough. Every line printed in the report struck against a line from the dream. The bed, the throats, the blood, the reaping hook by the door. Even the dismissed laborer returning to fulfill what had already seemed written. She had fled. They had stayed. The warning had come, and reason had laughed at it. Some tales of prophecy comfort, because they suggest order. This one does not. It only suggests that horror may announce itself and still not be prevented. Years later, it was said that Dinah Bellairs could never again sleep in a room whose door stood opposite another. Candlelight on polished wood disturbed her. The smell of iron in any context turned her faint. Harvest fields, with their bright hooks and bent laborers, became hateful to her. She had lost not only her friends, but her trust in the simple boundaries of home. For what is a bed, after all, if not the final symbol of safety? Sleep, marriage, blankets, a bolted country house, an orchard outside the window, a faithful dog in the hall, servants below, fields all around. And yet a man with a sickle had entered that sacred center and converted it into a place of butchery. The terror of the story is not only in murder, it is in violation. It is in the destruction of the ordinary. We expect death in lonely roads, in ruined abbeys, in midnight marshes, in war, in storms, in all the grand theatrical places prepared for it by fiction. We do not expect it in a respectable bedroom where husband and wife have gone up side by side after an uneventful evening, where one of them may have spoken of tomorrow's household business before putting out the light. That is why the image lingers. That is why the dream still horrifies, because it crosses the threshold that ought never to be crossed. And perhaps that is why Dinah's vision came clothed with such exactness. No mist, no symbols, no riddle, only a room, a bed, two people she loved, and the plain, brutal truth. Sometimes the worst nightmare is terrible precisely because it does not disguise itself. It says only this is what will happen. Look closely. Remember every detail. You will need them when daylight comes. If one wishes to imagine the last instant of Jane Watson's waking consciousness, one might picture this: darkness, the shock of Robin's body convulsing beside her, the wet sound, the smell at once metallic and hot, her own cry caught half-made, a shape looming over the bed with something curved in its hand, the candle or lantern flaring red through moving shadows, the pain swift and enormous, the knowledge not even fully formed that home has betrayed her. Then the ceiling above, swimming. Then nothing. And Robin. One imagines the old instinct of protection in him, the attempt to rise, the struggle with blankets twisted around his legs, the shock of cold steel dragging where no steel should touch, his hand reaching, perhaps not for himself at all, but toward Jane. These things make a story unbearable, and they also make it human. As for the house, old houses remember. Perhaps Weston House stood afterward in uneasy silence, its ivy still green, its porch still shaded, its rooms restored and scrubbed and aired, yet never innocent again. Servants would lower their voices on the stair. New occupants, if there were any, might wake at strange hours and listen without knowing why. There are places in which violence sinks into timber and plaster like a stain that no visible washing reaches. This is why stories such as this endure. Not because of the sickle alone, not because of the blood, not because of the murderer's face, but because they place horror precisely where life is most beloved. Friendship, marriage, hospitality, the offered bed, the country welcome. Then, into that circle, they admit one coarse hand from outside, and everything collapses. So if tonight, after this story ends, you step into your own bedroom and pause a moment before turning out the light, if you glance once at the door, and once at the mirror, and once at the shape of the bed, that will be only natural. If a distant noise in the house seems too deliberate, if a creak in the hall makes you hold your breath, if the thought comes unwillingly of candlelight reflected in something wet and curved, that too will be natural, because some tales do not leave when the telling ends. They sit at the foot of the bed. They wait in the passage. They stand in the fields in broad daylight, eating bread with work-rough hands, and look so human that reason insists there is nothing to fear until the morning paper says otherwise. And that is where we will leave Dinah Bellairs, with the memory of a dream that was more faithful than waking, and Jane and Robin Watson forever preserved in that dreadful double image, alive beneath the porch in afternoon sunlight, and dead upon their bed in a room gone red from wall to wall. If you made it to the end, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and like the video for more. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so divine. Whispers of the night will forever intertwine.